Revelation. The word itself conjures up images of mystical experiences or mythical adventures, or maybe even religious or spiritual truths. The fact is, Revelation doesn't have to be so remotely or unattainable. And tonight we're going to take an opportunity to use the backdrop of the Battle of Midway during World War II to talk about the simple truths of Revelation and how, if we pay attention, we can take hold of it, and if we don't, we can completely lose it. But we're going to start on December the 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attacked. Now, they had done their research. They had done all the pre-work, and they were ready, and it showed. They saw this as an opportunity of a preemptive attack to prevent the Americans and the Allies in general from basically stopping them from doing what they wanted to do, and that's conquer the Pacific. So for 7 hours on the morning of December the 7th, not only did they attack Pearl Harbor, they also attacked Guam, the Philippines, Wake Island, and they attacked the British Empire in Malaya, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Now, it's important to note that at this point in time, America was a neutral country in World War II. But neutrality is no excuse for lack of preparedness. The U.S. had received a number of credible threats of an imminent attack, not just an attack, but an imminent attack. And for whatever reason, we all know what happened. There was 2 revelations that happened that morning. One of them was for the Americans. It was their very first of the war. And this other one was for the Japanese. What was the American revelation that morning? It was kind of a slap in the face. They realized that saying that you're neutral and setting back on your laurels wasn't going to get you anywhere. In fact, it could end in devastation, and it did. For the Japanese, they learned a very simple truth. Hard work pays off. Now, Revelation is not merely, it's merely steps. It's not an outcome. It's not the end game. It's steps that lead to steps. And it's through a process in our life. If we pay attention to those revelations and those steps, then we can continue to grow and improve. But if we don't, then the tides can very quickly turn. Success can breed complacency and can foster infighting. And that's exactly what happened in the Japanese government and in the military. So Admiral Yamamoto, who was the commander of Imperial Naval Forces, started butting heads immediately after Pearl Harbor's attack with the Imperial Army. That doesn't go real well when you're trying to come up with a follow-up plan. The problem is he was also butting heads with the general headquarters. Now what this delayed the ability to come up with a follow-up plan and make the most of that initial attack, make the most of that initial devastation. In fact, it took until April to come up with a follow-up plan. And like most Japanese naval plans of the time, it was very complex, to say the least. The problem is, beyond the complexity, it also depended on something that we need to make sure we always have the right thing, and that's intelligence, and they had poor intelligence coming into it. They had information that was not up to date. It was outdated. In fact, they thought that the Battle of the Coral Sea that had happened in the early part of 42 had decimated the rest of our carrier fleet. It did have a negative effect. In fact, the USS Lexington, one of our carriers, was sank during the Battle of the Coral Sea. The USS Yorktown, it received damage, but not near as much damage as what was thought of by the Japanese. In fact, it was able to be repaired at Pearl Harbor and put right out to sea. And we'll see them again in action here in a little bit. They also were planning on something that did not exist. It was the general consensus in the Japanese government that because of that attack on Pearl Harbor, the will to fight of the Americans had been completely decimated, that we were demoralized and that we wouldn't go any further. And as we all should know, the complete opposite was the truth. Now, it was with these presumptions that the Japanese finally enacted Operation MI. Now, Operation MI started being talked about in April, as I mentioned, and the plan was to completely eradicate our ability to refuel in the Pacific and to launch attacks on the Japanese homeland. And how do you do that? You take out Midway, a small atoll in the middle or in the midway of the Pacific Ocean. Now, at the same time, we had a secret weapon in Pearl Harbor. And it was in the basement of the administration building at Pearl Harbor. And it's called Station Hypo. Station Hypo was part of the fleet signal group, and was responsible for code breaking. And they had jumped right into trying to make up for their failures from prior to Pearl Harbor, and they did a great job at it. In fact, they were able to figure out that the Japanese was planning an attack against a entity that they thought was Midway, and they did this by figuring out that the Japanese referred to Midway as using the initials AF, but they had to prove it. How do you prove it? So they had the commander of Midway send a decoded message saying that the fresh water supplies at Midway were severely low. Well, sure enough, within 24 hours, the Japanese sent a coded message to headquarters saying water levels low at AF. Great. So now we know there's an attack going to happen. We know it's going to be at Midway. But Station Hypo went even further. They were able to figure out through decoding that it was going to happen on June 4th or 5th. They were even able to figure out what the battle order was. So Admiral Nimitz, the commander of naval forces in the Pacific at the time, was able to know when, where, how, and with what strength the enemy was going to attack. That's pretty good information if you're going into battle with someone. Now, what's interesting too, there's 2 points that you got to wonder why the Japanese didn't change up their codes. Well, they did, but remember all the infighting and disagreements we talked about that delayed the plan? It also delayed a new code book. The new code book went into effect at the end of May. Well, the problem was we had already figured everything out. Obviously, some small nuances in there that changed, but we knew the plan. The other thing, it's a curious point, at least to me, why in the world did the Japanese not find it odd that we would be sending decoded messages about the water levels at a strategic base in the Pacific? Who knows? So in trying to keep this down to about 10 minutes, let's talk about the battle. We're going to condense 7 to 8 months into all of about 2 minutes. June 4th, 1942, at 4:30 in the morning, the Japanese launched the attack on Midway. Now, over the next 30 hours, attacks and counterattacks and follow-ups on land and air, on the sea, all occurred. Now, that doesn't include the withdrawal of the Japanese and the pursuit of them. But what were the results of that 30-hour battle that, for all intents and purposes, was the turning point of the war in the Pacific? Here's the results. The Japanese, 3,057 deaths. That doesn't count all the wounded. 4 carriers were sunk, as well as a cruiser. And 261 airplanes were lost, either being shot down or on the carriers as they went down. How did the Americans fare? About 10% of the deaths. We had 307 deaths. Obviously, there were some that were wounded. We did lose 1 carrier. I mentioned the USS Yorktown. It finally sunk, unfortunately. And we lost a destroyer and 109 airplanes. Obviously, a decisive victory for the Americans. But what about Revelation? That's what we're here to talk about. Revelation is no single moment standalone in time. Revelation is steps that lead to steps that on top of that lead to bigger and better things, but it only does that if we listen. Revelations are realizations that come to those who seek them. If you don't seek the revelation, you will not find the revelation. We heard that from our speakers already today. You'll hear more about it after I'm off. Revelation's not a little light bulb over the head. It's not some epiphany moment. Revelation comes, once again, to those who seek it. And whether you think about it consciously or not, we're always seeking something. We're always pursuing something. And that, whether we consciously realize it or not, is the revelation. Now, the U.S. was slapped in the face. There's no doubt about that at Pearl Harbor. But we learned from that, and even throughout all the other defeats that we had throughout the war in the Pacific, we put into place something that we could all take back into our life, and that's to seek, pursue, gain, repeat. Remember those 4 words. The Japanese also had a revelation. The problem was they became either cocky or content, arrogant in their revelation because they thought in their knowledge they had reached a pinnacle. I want you to ask yourself tonight, what revelations in your life have you viewed as complete? What revelations have you said is a ceiling that I can't surpass? What revelations have you just simply settled for as the step that is the highest that you can ever get? I urge you to adopt those 4 words, to seek revelation, to pursue revelation, to gain the knowledge of that revelation, and to repeat. That's my TED Talk. Thank you very much.